let's talk about one of my favorite microgenres, Vignettepunk. Vignettepunk games are not talked about very much, at least not as a genre, so welcome to the defining video on Vignettepunk. Vignettepunk as a genre is about freely wandering a world and looking at vignettes. For example, this. This is a vignette. So is randomly talking to this character. Anything that connects us to the world in any way, any emotional anchor, is a vignette. And they can be passive, they can be active, they can be long, they can be short. They're usually short just because you need a lot of them. All of these things work together to create the world. And as we wander the world freely looking at these things, that's the game. That's the joy we get. The strange things that happen in this world. Let's talk about it. Of course, I'm naming it Vignettepunk on purpose. These games are punk. They're part of the punk umbrella. They exist specifically to oppose common practices and culture within the game development industry. So that's a long way to say you're probably not going to like them. They do things that are specifically counter to what's supposed to be a good idea. And we'll get to examples of that, although I'm sure you can see several of them already. But no one's going to judge you for disliking a punk genre. Not everybody likes acid punk. Not everybody likes noise punk. So, if you don't like Vignettepunk, that's fine. Other games in this microgenre include an airport for aliens, currently run by dogs, Jazzpunk, and of course Paradise Killer. And there are others, but it's not a small genre, and it's surprisingly tight. Nearly all of these games share the same texture, the same feel, the same kind of assumptions and rebellions. They go in different directions with it, but they all have the same ideals. And that makes it really clearly, for me at least, really clearly a microgenre, rather than just a bunch of random indie games that Craig likes. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about what connects these games and why I like them. And obviously, this is all super subjective. The first thing that connects all these games is their utter lack of budget. These are punk games, and they have punk budgets. But rather than trying to hide their budget, rather than trying to look good, they look bad on purpose. They throw away what you would assume is good practice. This one, for example, not only are all of the characters these ugly tube models, not only are all of the objects untextured, low poly things, they've also chosen unpleasant colors, and they've put a pixel filter over the whole thing that crawls in an unpleasant way as you move. It's supposed to look ugly, because their whole point here is you don't need your games to look polished in the way that the game industry says is good. You can spend that lack of money somewhere else. You can get away with doing whatever you want to do. Don't be afraid of the lack of polish. It's a tool. It's a weapon. Use it. And I think that speaks very well. In this case, the characters are, in fact, 3D models within the world. The world feels contiguous and whole. Most of these have characters that don't fit in the world. For example, in an airport for aliens currently run by dogs, all of the characters are literally pet photos, like the physical photo floating in space. So, there's a variety. In Jazzpunk, they're all automatons. There's lots of stuff like that. In addition to looking this way, these games are all about exploring the world and discovering vignettes, and I'm pretty sure I've already mentioned that, but it bears repeating that these vignettes come in all different sizes and shapes. This is a vignette. But so is the multi-world mission to get dog shampoo. Big and small, there are lots of different kinds of vignettes of lots of different sizes, and they fit together to create the world that we are exploring. Another thing that all of these games share is a backup play, some kind of mechanic that allows you to get pulled through the world. And the mechanic exists solely to give you a reason to explore and find new vignettes. In this game, it's tagging. That green ghost over there, that's my tag. Any place you see a green ghost, that's someplace that I was lured to. You can see another one over there. Someplace that I was lured to so that I could explore the world. There's one there. But while I am doing those tags, I'm finding stuff like this. Vignettes. And this is true in all of the games. In the Dog Airport game, you need to find your boarding pass and then find your gate and then do whatever thing the dog at the gate wants you to do. It's just an excuse to move to the next area, to move through the world. And the point is that those things just keep you moving so that you can keep exploring rather than getting stuck and feeling like there's no point, feeling like there's no reason. They're thin excuses for gameplay rather than intended to be compelling, and they work well. I think that their job to pull us through the world so that we can see all that the world has to offer can be done without requiring them to be a compelling play in and of itself. I think there are a couple of other features these games share, but those three are the big ones. And in all three cases, you could argue that they are rebelling against the common game practices, common game dev practices. Obviously, the ugliness, the purposeful ugliness, or the purposeful low budgetness, is an obvious thing. But also the play, which is basically intentionally not very good, shows us that you can have bad, quote unquote bad play. You can have play that would be bad in another game, and it could be useful and good in this game. It's not a Kuso game. It's not a shit game. It's not a bad game. The bad play doesn't exist to be bad. The bad play exists to show you that you don't need good play. It's all about what the game does. It's all about how the game comes together. And even if your play is bad, if the game demands bad play, if the game is served by bad play, then the play is good. And it's the same with the vignettes. There's not really much of a story in these games. There's usually some kind of core beat. For example, in this game, we are theoretically trying to escape via the penthouse evacuation system of the CEO. And in Dog Airport, you have a wife that you're trying to follow around and talk to. And in Paradise Killer, you're trying to solve a crime. But those are not missions that exist to give you purpose. The world is not about you. It's not about your mission. It's counter to how that works. These are just fragments, little snippets that don't really come together and don't really make sense because that's the way the world works. The world doesn't come together. The world doesn't make sense, and it doesn't have to. So once again, they spend a lot of their time putting together something that betrays the standard approach. It argues that you don't need to have a player-centric narrative because why would you? Why would you need a narrative at all? It's not actually necessary. Look, we built a game without one. I think that's great. I think it works really, really well. And how much of that is conscious and how much of that is unconscious probably varies from dev to dev. I think the Dog Airport game is intended to have a wide appeal, even though it is still doing these punk things, for example. And I know that Paradise Killer is intended to have a narrative, but obviously the narrative is not super central to the game, so it still does this same sort of setup. What I'm getting at here is, although these games betray the standard practices of the game industry, they are not bad. These games are not bad. They're just different. And to me, that matters a lot because it means that these games are still good. They just do things in a way that you wouldn't expect. And we can learn so much from that. At least I hope we can. For example, what sort of pattern of vignettes do you think serves this kind of game? Now, that obviously will vary from game to game, but there is definitely some stuff that has been, clearly mined out, clearly discovered by these games. And you can see that some games have a much lighter sort of vignette style, like Dog Airport game has very few vignettes. It's pretty sparse, whereas games like this have very dense vignettes. Everywhere you go is packed with little details and people to talk to and whatever else you want to look at. So there's a wide variety in how many vignettes you have, and similarly, there's a variety in how long the vignettes are, how many of them are interactive, lots of stuff like that. But one of the things that's interesting is that in order for these games to be fun, the excuse play that you have, whether it's tagging or trying to find your flight, has to match with the density of the vignettes. The sparser the vignettes are, the more your secondary play has to shuttle you through the level as fast as possible. So the Dog Airport game, for example, because the vignettes are quite sparse, the excuse play is going to move you out of the world. You're going to move through the airport to a different planet, a different airport, pretty quick. And that's because they don't need you to linger in any one airport. There's not a whole lot there. Instead, you're going to revisit the airport later with different gear, different inventory items, different knowledge, and have a slightly different experience. But you don't want to stick around too long in any one place. Whereas in this game, the travel distances are much shorter. You have a lot of excuses like those green ghosts back there. I went over there and I painted them because I saw I could. So the play in this game is much choppier. It moves you much shorter distances, and the idea is that the experiences, the vignettes, are much more tightly packed, so you don't have to move nearly as far as you might think. This kind of study is really interesting to me, to try and figure out what makes these games work and what makes them fail. Obviously, this game type is very popular with indie devs that don't have a lot of time or working under very strict budget constraints or something similar. It's very popular with game jam games, for example. But that doesn't mean that all of the games in this set, in this genre, are good. Most of them are pretty crappy because the vignette density doesn't match with the excuse play. They don't support each other. And I just think that is a fascinating thing to study because it's something that we can use, something that we can study in other genres of game. Like, what if we talk about the sort of density we need for play like in Fallout 4? Is the Fallout 4 density correct? Obviously, it's not in this microgenre, but we can still talk about the same sort of concepts. I don't really have any strong answers on this. I have some ideas, but these are punk games, and they are always going to be strongly guided by the auteur. These are all going to be auteur games, and that means that when you try and learn from them, it's dangerous to try and learn some kind of universal truth, because that's kind of the point, that there are no universal truths. It's kind of the point that the things we take as universal truths are not. So, coming back around and saying, oh, well, this game taught me so much about what other games should be like. It's like, did it? I think it got the whole point was to tell you what other games don't need to be like, that you have more freedoms than you think. So I don't want to take it too far. I don't want to say, well, this is how you should do it. But there is definitely, humans work. Our brains work in specific ways and with specific timings. And these games are some of the most fundamental. There's not a lot going on here. The play is not something that can compel us on its own. So we have this really crystal clear example of how excuse play and world exploration intertwine at the most basic level imaginable. And that's worth studying. So if you want to get into this genre, I recommend that you start with Jazzpunk and then move on to Paradise Killer. If you like the look of this game, you can play it immediately. It's quite new. It's quite fast to play. It is a little tough to control, because that's the point. And if you want something that's more fluffy, you can try An Airport for Aliens, currently run by dogs. which is very, very fun, but it's much softer and fluffier and sparser than the other examples. So, take your pick. Try some of these out. They're all very cheap, very fast. They're all super low budget titles, so you're not losing much. And tell me if you learn anything. Have fun.